St. Louis was not the place for me, and moved out to Wyoming, enrolled in the University of Wyoming, and then one before. And it's the first time I'd ever heard a person give a talk like that, and had a profound impact on my decision and what I did. One of the things which was perhaps not a favor for David was that after I had to return to Missouri, I became the illustrator for the Friends of the Earth publication out of Columbia, Missouri, and did that for a year, and probably ruined their circulation, and learned shortly thereafter I'd better head back and be an instructor for Nols, because I was slightly better at that than I was at illustrating. And but since then I've retained a long-standing admiration and respect for David Brower, and I can't think of more of a pleasure than to have him come and speak for us tonight. Thank you very much.
Well, after all that speaking, do I have to speak too? Or are there any questions? Well, it's fun to be here, and it's fun after some 45 years of knowing Paul Petzl to meet him. It's not often that you can know a person that long without meeting him. And we were in the same outfit. We were in the Mountain Training Center. But there's such a thing as detached service, and he was detached in a different way from me. But I'm very happy to be here tonight. It's the first time I've been in a place like this. And first time, as far as I know, that I've been in Lander, but I can't trust in my advanced stages of Alzheimer's to remember where I've been. I point out to my assistant, Jimmy Langman, who comes from North Chapel Hill, that I need to be under constant surveillance. Because from time to time I double date myself, and I'm supposed to be here and there at the same time. But I'm glad I remembered where I was supposed to come today. And I got here faster than I wanted to. I flew from Berkeley, actually Oakland, to Salt Lake, and then drove a car. We got here faster than I expected to, because I just had to keep ahead of the trucks that were pursuing me. I find you can't do that without going about 85. My wife had wanted to come with me, but she couldn't have stood that. Somehow we've got to get those trucks on the rails. I don't know. I haven't seen so many trucks in one place so fast. Well, somebody asked me what I was going to say tonight, and I told them I didn't know. Does anybody have any suggestions? I like to start off, at least, by quoting some people to show that I have read something, even though I am a sophomore dropout. And I like to start, I think it's quite useful now, to start with something I used to end my speeches with, and that's probably the one I spoke back in 1971, the way I ended the speech. I quoted Adlai Stevenson. Adlai at that time had run for president twice and hadn't made it, but he was our ambassador to the United Nations, and in July of '65 gave the last speech, fell dead shortly after that in London Street. But not till he'd given us these words, and I'd like to start from those words and see what happens after that. But he said, "We travel together, passengers on a little spaceship, dependent upon its vulnerable reserves of air and soil, all committed for our safety and to its security and peace, preserved from annihilation only by the care, the work, and I will say the love we give our fragile craft. We cannot maintain it half fortunate, half miserable, half confident, half despairing, half slave to the ancient enemies of mankind, and half free in a liberation of resources undreamed of until this day. No craft, no crew can travel safely with such vast contradictions. On their resolution depends the survival of us all." Wonderful words. It seems to me, and I've said this rather often, that they should be about 15 feet high in the Oval Office, and the occupant should be required to read them, commit them to memory, understand them, and do something about them. And if that had happened, we wouldn't have had to send somebody to Greenland on the way to the Gulf War. We wouldn't have had a Gulf War. We would not have had all sorts of problems. We would, and you can learn this from your representatives from Kenya or for India or anywhere else, or Patagonia. We wouldn't have this gross imbalance. I was just at a conference in Aspen. The Windstar Foundation, John Denver's foundation, puts one on. And one of the final speakers was Whoopi Goldberg. And She took a while to get underway, and it was very amusing, and I won't go into that part. But then she finally asked the environmental question. What are you willing to give up? And that's a question that nobody wants to ask, but I think somebody's going to have to ask that for various reasons. One of them being this, that with just no effort on my part, and far less time than it took, I've had 81 birthdays. Now, I've cheated a little bit there. When Paul counts his birthdays, says he's 83, he probably forgets that he's had 84 birthdays, because the first one, everybody forgets to count. And that was really the birthday. I don't know why everybody's made that mistake so long, so I decided not to make that anymore. And then one day, July 1st in 1976, I was in Tokyo and flew home and arrived home on July 1st, 1976, so I had 2 birthdays that same day. But it was a different day, so anyhow, that's enough of that. But in the course of this, I have become an elder. And one of the nice things about the indigenous people is that they like to they heed their elders. So now you got to heed all that I've got to say from here on. But one of the things that I like to point out is that in my lifetime, and this is one of the, I'll distress you for a while and then try to cheer you up before it's all over. Oh, I should also point out that I'm going to go about 2/3 of the way through, and then I'm going to stop. And I'm going to ask for questions if you want to ask questions, but I'd rather have some statements. I got that idea from a conference on restoration in Berkeley 3.5 years ago, where they had a whole afternoon that they called town meeting. They had a couple of 4 microphones, and people were invited to come up and make statements, please no longer than 3 minutes. And it was fascinating what happened, and I've been fascinated with what's happened since then. Sometimes the statements are answered by people in the audience, and all I have to do is sit here and relax and listen. And anyhow, get ready to disagree with me, or to ask some questions, or to make some statements of things that you think are important that I haven't brought up. And then when I think you've asked made enough statements, I'll come to a stirring climax and sit down. But in any event, that's what's coming up. But right now, in my lifetime, some things that have happened that can't happen again. That's true of everybody. As Tom Crum, John Denver's point said, a friend said, eat right, stay slim, and die anyway. There's just simply no other way out. But so here, this 79.2 years is my actual age. In that time, the population of the Earth has trebled. The population of California, God help us, has gone up by a factor of 12. The Earth as a whole, all countries combined, has used 4 times as many resources in my lifetime as in all previous history. Now, 79.2 years isn't relevant to a lot of you people, so let's just look at the last 20 and take a couple of numbers out of the first chapter in State of the World 1991 by Lester Brown. In the last 20 years, that's since the first Earth Day, we've created enough new desert, all man-made desert. I won't bring women into this, I'll bring women into other things. This man-made desert, new man-made desert, that if we were producing food, instead of being new man-made desert, could feed the population of China. And by other means, we've destroyed enough soil, some of it by clear cutting. I've got to do something about the Forest Service here. By inundation with new reservoirs that are supposed to last forever but don't. Over-chemicalization of soil, erosion, development, whatever it is, we've lost enough soil productivity by other means to feed the population of India. So in 20 years, that's a number everybody can understand almost here, we've destroyed enough soil capability to feed almost half the population of the Earth. And we have destroyed enough forests. This is destroyed. There really isn't any sustainable forestry being practiced right now. They're just pretenses and hopes. But we destroyed enough forest to extend from the Mississippi River to the Atlantic seaboard. And the thing that I object to is that we are surrounded by institutions that think that can go on. That's universities, that's corporations, that's governments, corporations' customers, most of the environmentalists, almost everybody thinks that this can go on. Almost everybody thinks that economic growth and sustainable development are the key to the future. And economic growth, I think, is put upon us by economists. And Hazel Henderson has disposed of them very nicely. She said, economics is a form of brain damage. Sustainable development is an oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms. It's a failure to understand some of the limits that the earth has put on every living thing, and even some of the non-living things. That is, mountains don't last forever. They go down. They have to come back up. Anyhow, those two factors are being celebrated in a conference, the World Summit, Environmental Summit, coming up in Brazil next June. And it's environment and development. And somehow development has become something that we have become addicted to, and we've not learned how to understand the limits of the earth. We've lost, I think our most abundant resource has become our hubris. And I like to put it in context, just so that you can all see where I'm coming from in this one. So to put it in context, what do we have? Let's take inventory. I got this from Cousteau. If the earth were the size of an egg, all the water on earth would be but a drop on the egg shell. You look at the globe, it's 70% blue, so you know that's ridiculous. But if you do the arithmetic, and remember how thick the globe is and how thin the water is, including the glaciers and the oceans and everything else, the drop would be about 1/6 of an inch in diameter. I went on from there with a little help from people who can do arithmetic, and it liquefied the atmosphere for comparison with the seas and all that. And the atmosphere would be but a droplet, 1/32 of an inch in diameter. And the soil that we're all rather dependent upon, I've been talking about that, would be a speck barely visible to the naked eye. That's what we have in inventory, the drop, the droplet, and the speck, that make us different from anything else we know of in the universe. The only planet with life on it. I like to quote my son Kenneth there, a living planet is a rare thing, perhaps the rarest in the universe, and a very tenuous experiment at best. We need all the company we can get on our unlikely journey. Now, I don't think he meant more and more and more people, but all the kinds of company that we need in a living planet, that includes things besides people. We need that paradigm shift. Almost as big a shift in thinking has happened when we realized that the world was not flat, but round. Now the new paradigm shift we need is to realize that the earth does not rotate around us, that we are not the principal things. We're just Johnny-come-latelys. How recent are we? To get to that, just a little simple exercise for the instant replay. Just squeeze the age of the earth, 4.5 billion years, at least last count, down to the 6 days of creation, because that gives you something easy to work with. So if you do that, then the earth is created Sunday midnight. There's no life until Tuesday noon. Then life comes aboard. How we got life here, we don't know yet. There are lots of fine hypotheses. But here it is, here it came, DNA and all. And in the next few days, millions upon millions of species came as the world diversified. As life became more and more diversified, stable, beautiful, interesting. By Saturday morning, about 7, there had been enough plants that there had been enough chlorophyll that the fossil fuels could begin to form. And then at 4 in the afternoon, the great reptiles came on stage, had a long run until 9 o'clock that night when they were hooked off stage. Nothing like us until 3 minutes before midnight. Homo sapiens didn't show up until a half minute before midnight. And was content to be hunter-gatherer for a long time, for almost a 500,000 years really, but I'll stay by condensed clock. We didn't get off the hunter-gatherer kick until 1.5 seconds before midnight on Saturday when we invented agriculture. That's how recent that is. In the next half second, our practice of agriculture, particularly animal husbandry, had been so successful that the forests that ringed the Mediterranean were reduced to pitiful fragments, and after the Gulf Wars there probably aren't even fragments left. That happened, that was at our hand. 1/3 of a second before midnight, let's hurry on, Buddha. 1/4 of a second, Christ. 1/40th of a second, the Industrial Revolution. A 200th of a second, we learned how to split the atom. And now it's midnight. We've got to think about what we've been doing and how long a time. Think, for example, getting back to real time, about the indigenous people. We're about to celebrate them next year in the United Nations. And I think a lot of the indigenous people are going to have some different ideas and celebrations in mind when Columbus Day comes up for the 500th time. They take a dim view of the beginning of the strip search of the Western Hemisphere. But these indigenous people, including the Cree Indians, I'm trying to help them, with a lot of other people, to stop the Hydro-Quebec system of making a lot of their land go underwater so that they can provide hydroelectric energy to New England. That's James Bay. James Bay 1 has already been built. That involved the inundation of 5,000 square miles of forest. James Bay 2 is worse. Anyhow, the indigenous people lived for millions, not millions, thousands of years in balance with their environment. We did pretty well until we got into the industrial age. Then we got so much energy and so many tools that we could get under the surface of the earth. We could begin to rip the earth up the way it had never been ripped up before. And although we don't realize that, we've reached the end of that trail. Those numbers I gave you out of the State of the World in '91. There are lots worse numbers in that book. We cannot continue what we were doing. We've got to give up some things. We've got to live much more efficiently than we did. We have to recycle. There are all sorts of things we can do, and I'll get into that near the end before the question period, things I think we can do. But we cannot go on doing what we're doing. And somehow this idea has to get across. It has to be spread across. I don't see, with one exception, and I'm prejudiced, anybody in the political front who begins to understand this. I don't see anybody except one man who was rather abused by the press and by Doonesbury. And I was at his fundraiser last night because he'd announced he's running for president, Jerry Brown, my former governor. He gave me a chance to say a few words. He said just a few. Now, I wasn't born to do that here, so I'm going on and on. But I started out with something. I said that I've been telling audiences that we should watch the Soviets very carefully. And if they can make democracy work, we should try it. Then I went on, I said, I'll next quote George Wald, Nobel laureate, who told our first conference on the fate and hope of the earth in New York in 1982, if you want this country back, you're going to have to take it back. And then I turned to Jerry Brown and I said, this is the one man I think has enough brilliance and imagination to chart the course where we can take the country back, where we can make democracy work. It's not working. And he pointed out in a very stirring speech why it isn't working. He said he was going to run for the Senate. Then he stood back and realized that suddenly that if you're going to run for the Senate, you've got to spend about 45% of your time, or more than that, on a telephone raising money. If you get elected, you've got to spend 5 days out of 7 on a telephone raising money so you can get reelected. And you have to raise an awful lot of money. If you want to run for the Senate in California, you've got to raise about $40 million. Where are you going to get it? You have to make yourself beholden to people who have got that kind of money. And he went on and dwelled at that whole point for quite a while. And I think we all know that somehow. And we know that when we laughed at that joke, we should try it ourselves, democracy, there's something tragic in the fact that we can laugh at that remark. Because we do realize that we talk about democracy, but we don't have it. We do realize that we talk about freedom, but we don't realize what our freedom cost other people. We should get the people from Kenya, from Patagonia, from India, from anywhere else in the world except the industrialized nations to tell you what our freedom costs them. That's what Adlai Stevenson was talking about. And that's an idea that just isn't getting around the way it needs to. So it's back to the bad news that Whoopi Goldberg came up with. What are you willing to give up? There isn't enough to catch the world up with our standard of living. We have high-graded the resources. There aren't enough to exist to carry that out again. California, my own home state, the Great Valley of California once had 6,000 miles of salmon streams in it. We're under 300 now and trying to get rid of some of that. You can't do that again. Before my time, this is all in my lifetime, before my time, but not much before that, we had a lot of redwoods. 95% of those are gone. We can't do that again to redwoods. And you go down after resource, to oil, coal, whatever it may be. We can't do it again. There aren't resources enough to bring the others up to our standard. But then I'm rescued by that thought, and you could be too, by my friend Les Vangeli, who lives in Montana. He said, to hell with the standard of living. I want a better life. And a better life can consist of something quite different from what we've chosen to include in what they call a standard of living that we haven't really analyzed enough to see what it's cost us. So if you look further into State of the World 91, or you go back to the first one, which I think was 1983, year after year, Lester Brown has come up with these books, Lester Brown and World Watch. He's really one of the world's heroes. Those books have gone into more languages than any other books very quickly. So they're sweeping the world. And he got the Winstar Award this year, and he richly deserved. But if you just look at what's going, how we're just running the whole machinery down into the ground, and we don't have to. There's a quite different opportunity. But just let me just linger a little bit longer on how much we've run things into the ground. That is, the forests are in really rough shape. And I remember back in 1976 when I was in Japan, before I came home for my second birthday, I was addressing 7 Japanese cities, audiences there, about pluralism and about the United States. Well, I didn't know what pluralism was then, I know now. So I just gave my regular speech. And I was and I was talking about growth, because at that point they were very happy about their 8% annual growth in GNP. He said, well, look at this for a minute. If you keep that 8% growth up, then by the time a Japanese child born today is 21, old enough to vote, you're going to need 30 times as many resources as you have now. By the time that person retires, you're going to need 200 times that growth rate. Where are you going to get those resources? Because your papers are saying today, that was 1976, all the world's forests are not enough to provide Japan with the wood products it needs. And a lot of our forests are now going to Japan and wood products that it needs. And not just to Japan. I've just come back from the Soviet Union. It's my 5th trip. I'm working on, I'll tell more about that later if I get around to it, on Lake Baikal. The Soviets want us to help us save this oldest, deepest lake on Earth that has as much water as all our Great Lakes combined. 1/5 of the world's liquid fresh water is in Lake Baikal. 1,200 species, more or less, and still counting, of plants and animals that exist nowhere else. And the Soviet practices now being practiced, the industrial and agricultural pollution will kill it in 60 years. That's their number. So we're going to try to see if we can't help them not kill it. In any event, I learned this year, just 3 weeks ago, that a year ago, without anyone around the world knowing it, Mr. Yeltsin had signed a contract for Russia with Hyundai, a South Korean firm, they make cars too, for 2.5 million acres of Siberian forest to be cut, to be chipped, pulped. And that forest, right now, is the last habitat for the Siberian tiger, for the black merganser. And I don't know what all else, but nobody's thought about that. The thing was signed by Mr. Yeltsin. I guess he didn't listen to the biologists, or they hadn't learned how to catch his ear yet. So somebody suggested, well, I'll let the contract go, but just suggest that it's fine, go ahead with it, but take 200 years to do it. That would be a good working circle. In any event, here, the Soviet Union. Siberia has 26% of the world's forests, remaining forests. We hear about the tropical rainforest, we don't hear about Siberia. Canada has a lot. On and on with the forest. We cannot continue to do with the forest what we've done. We find right now that we cannot reestablish an ancient forest. You don't have time. It took millennia to build it in the first place. It took eons. You can't rebuild what took eons in anything that is of interest to us in our short lifespan. And you can't rebuild it, particularly if you don't know what was there in the first place, which we don't. We're learning more and more, or are we? Just on forests for a little longer, because the Forest Service people here know that I'm not famous for praising the Forest Service. I'm going to rethink, because of what I heard about grizzly bears from Gary Hunt today, I'm reappraising the Forest Service. You're so great. But about 40 years ago, when Bernie Frank was the head of the Forest Influence Department Division of the Forest Service, Washington office, he made the statement to me, "We know next to nothing about forest soils." 3 years ago at this restoration conference in Berkeley, we had some experts come down from Oregon who knew a great deal about mycorrhizae. Now, I'm sure you all know about mycorrhizae. That Irishman. But mycorrhizae are a fungus that works in symbiosis with the tree roots and other plants. And it's a terribly important reaction, but we don't know very much about it. These experts came down to say that we know so little that all we can say is that it's the right stuff. But when you clear cut, you cut off the relationship between the forest that was there and the mycorrhizal resource below the soil. It's very hard to build back, and particularly if we don't know which mycorrhizae are needed. And I got to a question period. I always like question periods. And I say, well, I reminded them what Bernie Frank had said. We know next to nothing about forest soils. He said, in view of what you're saying about mycorrhizae now, what would you estimate is the knowledge of forest soils in the timber industry, the forestry schools, the Forest Service? And the answer was, we know even less. So we need a new respect for forests. And it seems to me that the biggest argument I can come up with in the view of global warming and so on is, don't call them forests, just call them a good, safe place to lock up carbon, because we're releasing enough already. And we need to come up with some figures about how important that carbon lockup is to keeping the temperature of the earth what it ought to be. That's passing on to forests and soil in part. We know what's happening to water, all the things that are getting into it that shouldn't be in it. We know how many wells you can't drink from anymore. We know what's happening to water in the Gulf right now from all of the burning wells. We know what's happening to the air. We've heard of acid rain. We've heard about what's going on with the ozone barrier, and that to me is a frightful thing right now, because we don't know when the damage to that barrier will stop. If, for example, we stop using CFCs today, and all these gases that are attacking the ozone barrier, the damage already initiated by our past, according to the number I have, is going to continue for 100 years. What's the barrier going to look like then? I'll cheer you up with this figure. In the Carter White House, they asked a bunch of environmentalists to come listen to the arguments for the salt talks, because Mr. Carter and the State Department thought that nuclear weapons were rather a danger to the environment, so they wanted the environmentalists to be concerned about it. And they gave this figure. That was back in the Carter years. I haven't heard it followed up on since, but it was this scary figure. If we had an exchange between the Soviets and us of 10% of our inventory of nuclear weapons, hundreds of millions of people would die right away. But on the day of the exchange, there would begin a deterioration of the ozone barrier that would peak a year later, at which point no crops would grow. Well, that's it. Right now, we're getting a slow motion deterioration of the ozone barrier. Paul and I don't have to worry about that. We're not going to be around that much longer. I've asked for a 20-year extension. Have you asked for one like that, Paul? Try. Anyhow, but the rest of you are going to have to worry very much about this. What is going to happen? They're worrying about it very much in Australia right now. They've got to watch the time they spend in the sun because they're too close to that hole. And we're still not ready to cut down sharply right now the use of CFCs. No. So that's the air. A couple more things, then I'll go on to something more cheerful, I think. On energy. Right now, because of the interest in global warming, we're finding the nuclear industry getting all cheered up, and they're putting four-color ads in the papers saying that nuclear is the way out. It doesn't cause global warming or anything else. But don't be fooled. Two little stories about nuclear energy that I think you haven't been hearing from the industry will help you keep cool toward it. One comes from Ted Taylor, who invented quite a few of America's nuclear weapons. He's well informed on nuclear matters. He's well informed also on nuclear power and what happens with spent nuclear fuel. And in France, he knows that they reprocess it to get the plutonium for their breeder reactors. Their reprocessing station is at La Hague, France. He told me this story 10 years ago, where he said it's been running long enough, but then, it's been still running, it's running still, but back then, it had accumulated enough nucleides, these bad things that are the products of reprocessing, that were the La Hague reprocessing station to be destroyed on purpose or by accident, and either could happen, Western Europe would be uninhabitable. Now we got a taste of that with Chernobyl. But this is what would happen at La Hague. There have been quite a few little accidents, but no big one yet. But it seems to me that's a pretty high price to pay for nuclear electricity. I'd rather not pay it. And then there's the question of nuclear waste, which we still have not solved. We don't know what to do with it. The British were pretty close. They started by burying it, dumping it in the Irish Sea, which they thought was pretty good for the... Come up with the answer. If we got the perfect place to put nuclear waste where it could not, for the next 100,000 years, get in touch with any living thing, and we knew we had methods to control that for 100,000 years, we would still have the current problem of moving spent nuclear fuel from the reactors, the 113 reactors that are now making it, to this depository. From Dr. Livingston. Is this going to be better?
That one's fading.
Fading? Or am I fading?
No. Does that work?
No. Can I be heard? No. Now can I be heard? Yeah. Sorry about that. Dr. Livingston, Robert Livingston. He's a Sierra Club member in San Diego. He's also a member of Physicians for Social Responsibility, and he's well informed in these matters. And I checked his number with Amory Levins, who's very well informed of these matters. Bob Livingston's number was this. If you're shipping nuclear fuel on highways or railroads, and almost every day you'll read of a spill on a highway or a railroad, a chemical spill, they have to be shipped in casks, which are very rugged casks. But they've been tested only to sustain a 30-foot fall or a 35-mile-an-hour head-on crash. Well, things go faster than 35 miles an hour, and they drop farther than 30 feet on certain bridges and so on. So just imagine that you have one of these casks with spent nuclear fuel in it, broken open, and you have spent nuclear fuel. If one of those spent fuel rods, 26 feet long, were laid alongside a highway, 1 meter from the edge, and you drove along the edge of that highway in a motorcycle at 90 miles an hour, you would get a lethal dose of radiation. Now, the people that are giving you the four-color ads in nuclear power don't tell you that. This is one of the great hopes that we all had. I was pro-nuclear for years and years, from the dropping of the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which I thought were necessary at the time. We're not so sure now. But that kept me from combat. I was on my way home from combat in Italy to go to combat on the Japanese beaches. Instead, on VJ Day, I danced with my wife at the Claremont Hotel in Berkeley. So I was grateful for those bombs before I understood more about it. And then I kept being grateful for nuclear power until the late 60s, when I realized even then they were just fooling us about waste. So all I'm trying to say is don't buy the nuclear escape. There are much better ones, there are much cheaper ones, and we can go into that in the question period if anybody's interested. But on to just living things. It's rather nice to have a lot of company on this, our voyage, our otherwise lonely voyage on this earth. And we're getting rid of that company awfully fast. You've heard this. You've heard various numbers about how fast we're extinguishing other species. But it's just going much too fast. And it's at our hands. The rate of extinctions in ordinary normal evolution was pretty slow. But we stepped it up to where we're losing a species, a plant or animal, every minute if you take these two assumptions. One, that we have 50 million species of plants and animals. The estimates range that I've heard of plants and animals on Earth from 4.5 million to 80 million, which means we don't know. So I just picked 50 out of somewhere between. And then applied the rate at which we're extinguishing the species in the tropical rainforest, where half the species are assumed to exist. I just put those two figures together and divided them out. Now, if instead of 50 million, there are only 5 million species, then we're losing one every 10 minutes. And I don't think that makes me feel any better. We're not understanding what we're doing. We can't quite get the image in front of the people. Since I like to watch the 49ers play, I just would say, well, I want to imagine a piece on television where Joe Montana goes out to throw a pass to Jerry Rice, hoping that his arm will get fixed up so he can pass again. And I figured out, I watched a couple of games, figured out how long the pass was in the air, a long one of the bombs. Then I just do a brief, they can do anything with pictures now on the computers, a brief scene. So the football field is a tropical rainforest, and it's back to a football field. But in the course of Joe's letting go of that pass and Jerry's catching it, 3 football fields full of tropical rainforests will disappear, will be destroyed. That might get the idea across faster than some other statistic. But we're just losing these things that we cannot repeat. A species is chemically unique, engineeringly unique, whatever you want to say. If it's gone, it won't be back. And we're just doing that at this frightful rate. Whatever the rate is, it's much too fast. Jay Hare, the president of the National Wildlife Federation, tells a story that you may have heard, or may have heard somebody else tell it. And I think points this up. Jay Hare and his wife had a daughter who, when she was 3 years old, had an illness that led the doctors to say she has 4 days to live. Now, any of you who are parents would know what that would mean and how tragic that would be. She's in college, doing all right. What healed her problem was a medicine derived from the rosy periwinkle, which, as Jay Hare tells it, grew only in Madagascar and is now extinct. Now just multiply that opportunity with our own self-interest. What is in these places that we barely learned to understand, that people far less educated than we, but more aware of what goes on in the earth, the indigenous people, understand far better than we are. So we're getting rid not only of the plants and the animals, but we're getting rid of the indigenous people. Well, we have opportunities to improve quite a bit. I've got to change the mode here a little bit, because here's about the time to tell a story that is told by Ian McHarg in his book, Design with Nature. He was telling his students that the final nuclear exchange has occurred. A thin gray pall covers the earth. All life has been extinguished, save for a colony of algae so deep in a crevice that they're spared from radiation and blast. They hold a meeting. They realize that 3.5 billion years of evolution must be repeated. 3.5 billion years of trial and error, success and failure, on and on and on. And they come to a unanimous conclusion. Next time, no brains. So, but we have brains. We have this extraordinary capability that makes us conscious of the universe. There's no other living creature that we know of that has this consciousness, that is aware of what's going out there, what the Milky Way consists of aware of black holes, of pulsars, of the Big Bang, or whatever. And the Big Bang always amuses me, because they say that was about 20 billion years ago, and God heard the scientists discussing that, and God said, "Which Big Bang?" We need to extend our thinking, but we've done pretty well. So we have brains. We can do something. And I've been trying to think, well, what are the kinds of things that will get everybody united in an effort to save the earth rather than to go on squandering it or being so reckless about it and just assume that we can do anything we want to and it will recover. That gives me another 25 minutes to talk now. Not really. But what can we do? I came up suddenly with an idea that would get everybody interested. We worry about killing the planet. On a dead planet, there'll be no colors of human beings. There'll be no human beings. There'll be no Republicans, no Democrats, no economists, no environmentalists. That doesn't get people's interest. So I've gone on to farther than that. On a dead planet, there'll be no sex. Now you've got to take me serious. So we got to think pretty hard about what we need to do to save it. And we started, back in 1982, we started this series of conferences on the fate and hope of the Earth, and we had one in New York in '82. And the whole idea was conservation and security. We're trying to point out that if you take good care of the environment, that's the most important route to security. So we wanted to get the peace and the environmental movements working together. It wasn't easy. They both thought their plates were full already, so the environmentalists couldn't worry about peace, and the peaceniks couldn't worry about environment. But we got them working together. We got 14 organizations, including Physicians for Social Responsibility, working together. And we had a very good conference. We held it in the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City. Had 1,000 people. Had some very good results. So we had another one 2 years later in Washington, but we didn't advertise it well enough. We only had half as many people. But instead of just 14 endorsing organizations, we had 125. 2 years later in Ottawa, back to 1,000 people, and 297 endorsing organizations, 45 environmental, 45 peace, the rest from all over the lot. That sounded pretty good. At that point, it was suggested we have the next one in Managua. And that seemed a little bit tough, but there was enthusiasm for it. It took an extra year to get it done. We had 1,400 people there from 65 countries. The white people were very much in the minority. It was an extremely successful conference. And we had a lot of help from Daniel Ortega's government. Maybe we can get another conference with the present government, I don't know. But the people then who came lobbied us to have the next one in Zimbabwe. Well, we haven't held that yet, but we're working on that one. But the whole idea here was to try to build a coalition of all the interests, all the human interests. What can we do that's different? What can we do to change our way toward working with the Earth? What are the problems? What are the solutions? How do we go about it? And we're still working on that. And then something else happened. A young biologist named Sam Labuddy took his camcorder and his guts aboard a tuna boat and made a record of what the tuna fishermen were doing to the dolphins. The footage he got, he said, well, I had this camcorder. My father gave me this as a toy, and I'm going to see how it works. That was his cover. Earth Island Institute and Earth Trust got him that camcorder. He was working with both of us. This footage was totally devastating. It got on a 60-minute segment in Australia. It was around the news on regular nets. A full film was made on that general subject, what's happening to the dolphins. And the upshot of all that was in two parts. One was that H.J. Heinz, the most important Fortune 500 company that were working on, that they were selling tuna meat, switched. They said they were going to produce from here on, they were not going to take any tuna that cost dolphins. And that was a great move, and the other companies followed suit in this country. The story goes on, but that's enough for now. Sam then took his camcorder and his guts on a boat that was a drift net boat. And again, his cover was not pierced, and he's still alive. He got devastating footage of what was happening in the high seas. Every night, 35,000 miles of drift nets are laid out to fish blindly. They catch fish, they catch whales, they catch dolphins, they catch seabirds, they catch turtles. They are strip mining the ocean. And what Sam did with his camcorder is change things enough that the United Nations now and the United States are working hard to cut the drift net fishing tragedy down to zero. Sam next went to Alaska, where he'd heard that young Eskimos were machine gunning walruses to trade the ivory in their tusks for drugs. I haven't seen his footage on that, but if you want to be cheered up, I'd just try that one for your cheerful hour. And Sam wanted something else to go on. He wanted something more positive than all this stuff. So he came up with the idea, well, let's have an Earth Corps. He wanted an Earth Corps that would go on where the Peace Corps left off. Not be a U.S. event, but be an international, a global effort. And he wanted it to be more interested in the environment than the Peace Corps had so far been, particularly with endangered species. And he still wants that. And what he had done is won him the Goldman Award. There were 6 Goldman Awards given this year, one for each of the 6 continents. Sam the Buddy got the one for the United States, for North America, $60,000 for each of them. Sam took that $60,000 and took $10,000 of that to pay off his student debt, on which he had not yet made any payments, and gave the other $50,000 to Earth Island Institute so that we could go on with programs getting camcorders to people like Sam to go out and get the hard news of what was happening. So there could be something like what they got with the camcorder in at the LA Police Department, but it had to be environmental instead. So this is one of the things that's still going. All right. Sam liked the Earth Corps idea, began telling about that in speeches, especially to student audiences. They were charmed with that idea. They were all excited. They wanted to do something about it. Alternative service, good service to do. And then we found that the name was preempted by Earthwatch rather, and other people have been using it. We still want to use it globally, but in any event, in January, a year ago January, at the Global Forum in Moscow, what I think was the greatest speech made by a world leader about the environment was made by Mikhail Gorbachev. And I liked it well enough that I took out a full-page ad in the New York Times Western edition and reprinted the whole speech. And it's in volume 2 of my autobiography, which isn't out yet. A great speech. And one of the things that Gorbachev called for was a green cross. Now the Red Cross, my quick interpretation, the Red Cross takes care of the damage that the Earth does to people and structures. The Green Cross would take care of the damage that people and structures do to the Earth. Turnabout fair play. And Sam said, that's a much better name than Earth Corps. So we started to sell the Green Cross, International Green Cross as an idea, and then found out, to my surprise, that the cross, globally speaking, is not that well revered a symbol. The Jewish people don't like it. The Muslims don't want it at all. They like a crescent instead. So Carl Anthony, who was the president of Earth Island Institute, came up with a compromise name. He said, why don't you call it the International Green Circle? And if anybody doesn't like a circle on a spherical planet, well, they can take off. But so we're trying that. And what's this green circle all about? It's primarily about restoration. That's what the cross was to be. What can we do as best we can, to put back into working order the things that we have taken apart in our civilization? Now, it's a little arrogant to assume that you can heal the Earth, but healing the Earth is a good concept, and it's a good thing to try to do, whether you're succeeding or not. And the idea, the speech that the title for my talk tonight is Healing Time on Earth, is not of my origin. It's from Noel Brown, who heads the United Nations Environment Program in North America. He gave a speech at that restoration conference where he said it's healing time on Earth, and gave 10 United Nations Environment Awards to people who had done very good jobs in restoration in this country. Those deeds were described in John Berger's book, Restoring the Earth. John Berger himself has been pushing restoration. There are now in the San Francisco Bay Area's 9 counties, 152 restoration projects that people are working on. We're trying to get others going. It's not a new idea, of course. Back in Jerry Brown's period as governor of California, Huey Johnson, his resources secretary, came up with something he called investing for prosperity. And at a time when the California legislature was cutting all the budgets of everything, Huey got $125 million a year for this program that consisted primarily of restoring forests, not just planting trees, but growing forests, restoring wetlands, restoring streams, and restoring soil fertility, and a whole bunch of other projects too. Those started, those have already paid off, they're still going on, but at a slower rate, and it's up to us now to go to our present governor and his resources secretary, who was the 3rd executive director of the Sierra Club, and say, let's get that going again. It's up to Jerry Brown to get it going again as he talks about his presidency. But the whole idea of restoring, building back, putting the life support system back together. There's some good examples of it, and one of the most exciting examples around the world, as I know of now, is what Professor Dan Jansen of Pennsylvania has been doing in Costa Rica where he has been restoring the dry tropical forest. When he went down there, as he wrote in an article of Science, he said that we were confronted essentially with scattered biotic debris in the living dead. Now, those are pretty dismal terms, scattered biotic debris, but that's what development had done to what had been an integral whole system, ecosystem. It just scattered its parts. And the living dead were the species that didn't probably have enough biomass left to perpetuate themselves. But taking what he had, he started to piece back together what he could. That's been going on for several years. It's been getting a lot of notice. And one of his brilliant moves was to take the people who had been paid money to take the environment apart, and he's paying them money to put it back together. They, better than anyone else, could remember where the parts were. Well, in our own recent work, we're trying in Earth Island, we've got this project, the International Green Circle. We don't want it to be exclusive. We want the Sierra Club to be involved in it, the National Wildlife Federation. We want a whole series of organizations to be involved in trying to put back, with their best talents, what we've taken apart. And I think we're going to succeed. We're trying hard right now in Lake Baikal. I went over there 3 years ago at the invitation of the Soviets to see what, to go to a meeting where there were some 200 Soviets. Glasnost was loose, perestroika was working. 200 Soviets from the Baikal region were meeting, and there were 3 Americans, Michael Kinsley from the Rocky Mountain Institute, Ann Brower, and David Brower. Ann was along because when they invited me, I got this call at the office from Moscow State University. I thought, this must be Idaho. No, it was the older Moscow. And they were willing to pay my fare from San Francisco to Lake Baikal, which is a long way off. Baikal is 7 jet hours from Moscow. It's a big country. Pay my fare all the way and back. And I knew how hard it was to get dollars over in the Soviet Union. So I said, well, how about this deal? I'll pay my way to Moscow if I can bring my wife with me, and then you pay the ruble cost of both of us from there on. And they said, that's fine. So there were 3 Americans, some 200 Soviets, what they called a game, where they were letting their hair down, people for and against the lake, with all sorts of ideas about what should happen. And they came up with the idea that it should go into the World Heritage. Now, the World Heritage is something they could not put anything in earlier because you have to sign the World Heritage Convention. This was dreamed up by Russell Train in the mid-60s, and I was working with him peripherally at the time. And we came up with a list of areas that should be in the World Heritage. Back then, we had 100 areas that were endangered, and Lake Baikal was one of them. So here, when I had the chance to go there to listen to what was happening at Baikal, I was very pleased they wanted to do something about it, and pleased that the Soviet Union had signed the convention, and now they wanted to see what they could do, what help they could get in getting it in. They wanted me to come back again with some scientists and others. I was a little slow about it, but a year and a half later, rather than a year later, I came back with a party of 22. We went up the head of Lake Baikal. We had a bunch of Soviets, 24 of us, 3 dozen of them. We came up with 172 different recommendations. They're moving forward slowly. And one of the things that came out of that was that George Davis, who has been with the Forest Service in the Washington office, who's been with the Wilderness Society, who's worked with Governor Cuomo and the Adirondack Forest Reserve, trying to make the biggest reserve we've got in this country safer and part of the Biosphere Reserve itself. He had received a MacArthur Award. I heard about him and called him up, and he was going down to Columbia, and I changed his mind, and he went over with us on our second trip, and is back there this year with a whole team of scientists, Soviet ours, looking at the entire Lake Baikal Basin to see what could be done about the entire basin to make Lake Baikal safe. Has got a study that will be completed in another year with lots of Soviet support, and I was over there this year and just left on the 15th of August. And guess what happened after I left? I came across, coming around, I took the new flight. You can go from Siberia now to Alaska by Alaska Airlines. Arrived in Alaska, joined my wife for 6 days on the inside passage in the boat. Got out of the boat and found there had been a coup that was all over a coup. So I missed all the big news. But in any event, we still have to work hard on this idea, no matter what the form of government is. Siberia, which contains Lake Baikal, is still in Russia, which is part of whatever they'll call what's left when they rename it, the Union, not the Soviet Republic, the Confederation or whatever it may be. But we have to keep working on that because this is an extraordinary place. And this is an example of what we can do in the Green Circle. We can get various skills together. That's a very complicated and a rather expensive way to go about it. But the general idea on the Green Circle is that we'd like to get all the colors mixed up. We'd like international teams, all the colors, all the creeds, various parts of the economic ladder, all the ages, so that Paul and I can do something, and all the sexes. And I come from San Francisco where we count 8. But, but it seems to me if you can make teams like this and somehow get people to put their differences, their much celebrated differences, whether it's religion, that's where most of the wars start anyway, or whatever, put their differences aside and learn how to work together, we have the one formula that I think can put things back together. Now, I've been talking about this now for quite a while. I've talked to about 200,000 people, and I never talked to, even though I've talked to returning Peace Corps veterans, I've never talked to an audience where I hope to get more support than from this audience here, because I know what outdoor leadership means, what it leads you to, what kind of boldness it builds in you. So I've asked this question again and again. How many people in this audience, I can't see you, but I guess I can, so you can't hide. How many people in this audience would be willing to commit at least a year out of the next 10 to helping us develop the Green Circle idea and working on it around the world, or here? Now, I don't see as many hands as I want to. I'm going to ask the question the other way so you know how polls are supposed to be taken. How many people in this audience would be unwilling to spend a year in the next 10? All right. See? No hands. I used to put it just 1 year, and I got a hand the other day, and a woman put up her hand and said, well, why not? She said, I'm not willing to spend 1 year. I want to spend 10. But this is the response I've got around talking to some 200,000 people. Is about 2/3 of the people who put their hands up. All we lacked is the people who go around and get their names so we could sign them up and get them taking this seriously. But we're sending questionnaires around. You can write to Earth Island and find out more about it. Are you interested? Where would you like to go? What are your skills? How could these be applied? Do you know people who could work with you on this? Do you know people with money? And other questions like that. Would you need help? Would you need help, or can you bring help? And this is what we're working on, and I think it's one of the most important things. I want to concentrate my remaining years, whatever number I get, on this thing because I can't think of anything more important. I can't think of any road that is more likely to lead to global security and peace than the ability to work with people with whom you have disagreed on almost everything else, but agree that this is probably the planet we better stick with and keep in shape. Now, I'll come up with a stirring climax later, and it'll be a very short climax, but it's time now for me to come up with the offer I made so long ago. Are there questions, or preferably, are there statements? Now, I know it's very difficult to get the first question. A TV anchorman had an audience in Stanford and said, well, I know how hard it is for anybody who asks the first question. Anybody here with a second question? That was Ted Koppel. Or a statement. Now, I was warned that you're all going to be like a Japanese audience, and there must be some sort of seniority system, and nobody can do anything until some certain person that you all know makes the first statement or question. Is that true? Or are you free people, beholden to no one? Can you make a statement? Can you ask a question if you want to? There, everyone.
I probably have about the least seniority, the way I see it. You asked the question, are people willing to give a year of their lives for the environment? And as someone who's not an instructor and who is a actual, relatively newcomer to the school, I'd just like to say that I believe that there are many, many people in this room who've given more than 1 year for the environment.
Well, that's 1 year, but I want restoration. That doesn't, protection must go on. That's terribly important. I don't want people to forget that. If you don't protect the wild places we have left, then you're not going to have a pattern that you're supposed to build back to. And if you restore something and learn how expensive and how difficult it is, then you're going to be a little bit careful about tearing it apart next time. So that they're back to back. Protect, and you've been protecting. You've been teaching people how. I don't know how much you've been teaching people how to try to rebuild what was there, how to find the elements. And I don't know where you would go right now to learn how, because it's going to take new curricula in our universities. There's some things. There can be ecological engineering. There can be, I'm not just trying to take nature, but I'm trying to build better. Everything we've done, we can do better. It's a challenge. But to build back takes courage, a bit of arrogance, but at least we can jumpstart nature and give nature a chance to do it. Maybe a little bit like hair transplants. All right, well, thank you for your
Excuse me, but where, say, the local people are in conflict with what we might, with our ideas and how we might best preserve their environment?
Mm-hmm. I'll go to a little bit more detail on Baikal because I've been working on it now for 3 years. There are a lot of people that were there with very different ideas about what should happen. One of the ideas, for example, they'd spent in the city in the north end of Lake Baikal, Severodvinsk, it's a city of 30,000. It was started as a city of 20,000 to build a new routing for the Trans-Siberian Railway. They wanted it further from the Chinese border, and they also wanted, I think, to rip off resources. But the railroad is built, and you don't need 20,000 people to run it once it's built. So here's a whole city with 20,000 people, and there are not going to be very many jobs. What else can they do? Particularly since, in the time since it was built, they've been fertile, and there are now 30,000 people. So what do you come up with? So that's one of our challenges. What can we come up with that'll put some money in the areas that keep the economy alive? And that's a major challenge. And we're trying to come up with some advanced education with some industries that have a lot more work added. So if they're going to capitalize on a Siberian forest, and there are lots of them there, then don't run a pulp mill. And they've got 2 pulp mills which are polluting the lake. But take those forests and add human labor. Just do something with the trees that requires a lot of human effort, not just a machine that grinds things up to pulp. And there are spectacular examples of what might be done there. Or if you start thinking of what can people do, what can crafts do, what can you do to make careers instead of just jobs of knocking trees down. And this is part of the challenge. And we're also wanting ecotourism, tourism that doesn't destroy the area, that leaves a lot of money there, that has education mixed up with it. So you don't go there just to take pictures, but you got to learn about the place, become part of its salvation. That's a big example, but little examples are just, we're trying to restore, for example, in our Bay Area, and it's a little controversial, we're trying to get rid of non-native trees. We're trying to get rid of the eucalyptus that was imported from Australia, which is a very nice tree, it's very pretty and everything else, but it puts out its own herbicide, and other things don't grow underneath it, except in Australia. So we're, at least in certain places, we're trying to get back to some of the natives, and that's a bit of restoration. And it takes some thinking to do it. It's not easy. And there are a lot of people that love the eucalyptus and don't want them cut anyway. But I could go on with lots of examples, but maybe some of you have already been into some work like this of restoring a stream. We're trying to restore Strawberry Creek in Berkeley. Salmon used to spawn where the University of California campus is. Now, a lot of the creek runs in a pipe. Where possible, over the next years, we're going to start releasing it. We've already begun. And then, of course, what can make it very easy, as a geologist friend of mine once pointed out, if we have the 300-year flood on Strawberry Creek, they'll have to rebuild the University of California campus. So it'll probably find its own way back to the bay. But various ideas are just big things, little things. I want to restore transportation. I want railroads back. I want those damn trucks on flat cars. The Army can do something about it. The Corps of Engineers stop building dams, but make the railroads work. Just come up with ideas. There are all sorts of things that need to be done. There's enough work to keep a lot of people busy, and it could be profitable. Over here.
David, do you have following up on this question, is there an inventory in the United States, because that's where most of us are, where you and your organization would recommend that restoration needs to take place, that people could begin focusing on, or do we have to ourselves identify where the primary restoration needs to take place?
I think that you can build up an inventory. There isn't a lot of places that need restoring. For one, in your neighborhood, the Presidio of San Francisco. I've got ideas for that. We want a World's Eco Fair there in 1995, and I'll be talking to you about that because we're going to need the Sierra Club behind it. In any event, there are lists. This list of 152 things that are going on in the Bay Area, you probably haven't seen it. But I'll send a copy. I'll take a copy up and get the Sierra Club thinking about this. If the Sierra Club groups began to look around, these 360 groups or whatever the number is now, began to look in their own neighborhoods. What can be done? If the Audubon chapters did that, if the Wildlife Federation affiliates did that, the list would grow pretty fast. Right now, the biggest list has been put together by the Department of Defense. They listed a whole full page in the New York Times of things that they want to start restoring. So that it could be big business. Get in on the bottom. Invest now. Yes, Paul. All right.
We used to have a person come out here that liked trout fishing. And I'm not mentioning his name, but he was somewhat of an authority on world population. And I let him talk to some of our groups out there in the hills. And he told us about the population, and when he was all through, the kids spoke up because they expected a Hollywood ending. They said, what can we do? He said, it's too late. And that shocked me. And after reviewing and studying a little bit, and I've almost reached the conclusion, unless we do something about that first, and real quick, that everything you're talking about may not make any difference anyway.
Well, this is, Paul Ehrlich made this point back in 1968 in the population bomb. If you don't solve the population problem, you don't even get a ticket to solve any others. But what we found out very quickly is that when we started talking to that, saying that, giving that message to the very fertile countries in the third world, the developing countries, they said, well, who's the burden on the earth? Our numbers or your overconsumption? And they had us there. So wherever I talk about this, and I'm glad you brought it up, it's terribly important. We've got to look at both. 5% of the world's population in the U.S. and our use of resources is somewhere between 30 and 40% of the world total. So that we, in that sense, the sense of demographic drain, numbers times appetite, we are the most overpopulated country of all. That doesn't mean we don't worry about numbers. We have to worry about numbers. We have to worry about overconsumption or wasteful consumption or our addiction to early obsolescence, our refusal to recycle. You've been out in nature long enough to know that nature recycles everything, everything. And we're just beginning to be smart enough to learn a little bit of that. So we have to go after both. But just don't say it's too late, because then all they have is despair, and they go for a drug or a chemical trip, or I'll order another martini.
Well, that's like the old pool hall saying, if rape is inevitable, relax and enjoy it.
That's fine, except that I think the coming generation realizing, I know, it's very funny. The current generation realizes which generation was enjoying the rape, and there won't be anything left. And that's the problem. That if we stretch our looking ahead to what the indigenous people, for the most part, do, looking ahead 7 generations, round that out at 200 years, and if we start planning things in a 200-year cycle, and if the economists do that, which they haven't done yet, if the economists begin in their pricing system to say, well, what you must consider is the cost of the earth and the cost of the future, not just the cost of this quarter's operations, then we'll become much better answers. I want replacement pricing. How do we get it? I don't know. But if I buy something, I should be willing to pay what it costs to get that same product again out of the same piece of the environment because we didn't destroy the environment in getting it. That's the basis of restoration, that you keep the system going. Nature did it. Aren't we bright enough to do that too? I think we are. But we have failed in a couple of rather important examples. For example, we don't know how chlorophyll works in photosynthesis. It's in the public domain there. Everything that's green out there is doing it. We haven't figured that out yet. And another one that I love is that making cement. We have to go to 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. That's energy intensive. A hen can make stronger cement per unit at 103, and a clam can do it at the temperature of seawater. What's the matter with our technology? There, it's done, it's possible. Why can't we do it? We've got all these challenges. We've got nature, if we leave enough of it left, to give us examples that are the challenges that will go on forever. Always, I think, giving us a sense of wonder, giving us a sense of achievement when we figure out how. I think I've been keeping you a long time. Is it time for the stirring climax, or are there statements out there? There's a statement or a question.
You mentioned profitable, big business, I guess, or just profitable, and how to attack these problems. And I wonder how you feel about, in a sense, relying on business to be able to solve these problems when it seems like you also feel that business is being part of these problems in the first place.
Well, I agree with you thoroughly that business has caused a great many of the problems. That I have a little litany. This goes on for just a minute. That way back when I was the executive director of the Sierra Club, Russ Train told John McPhee for this book, The Arch Druid, thank God for Dave Brower because he makes it so easy for the rest of us to be reasonable. I got back at him once. I said, thank God for Russ Train because he makes it so easy for anyone to be outrageous. But, but then I went from that, so I founded Friends of the Earth to make the Sierra Club look reasonable. Dave Foreman founded Earth First to make Friends of the Earth look reasonable. Then I'd say, now we need somebody to make Dave Foreman and Earth First look reasonable. And people would cheer. You didn't cheer tonight because Dave Foreman and others have been going through some rough times. But my own feeling is that I wish Earth First were unnecessary. But there are lots of things going on yet that the message has not got through on. It's a long story. Then one day, when we were closing a bar together, I told Dave Foreman, hey, the organization that makes you look feasible already exists. I call it Earth Last. And its membership is primarily the Fortune 500. Now that's true, not all of them. But it has been perfectly all right under the law to consider the Earth a freebie, and the future something you can discount. The economists do it, almost to a man, and to a woman, except for Hazel Henderson. And this is something that needs to be corrected. And business needs to realize there'll be no businesses, let alone sex, on a dead planet. And they all really want to stay in business. And H.J. Heinz has said they can do it. Ben & Jerry's figured out how to do it. Patagonia has figured out how to do it. Smith & Hawken, you can start the body shop. There are lots of organizations that are getting this idea. And with a few changes in the law, I think we can make it possible, which is not possible, for corporations to bypass the opportunity for profit without being sued by the stockholders. Right now, that's what they're vulnerable to. Now we can change the law, can't we, to make it possible for responsible reasons, for good ecological or sociological reasons, say, I got to bypass this opportunity for profit. Wouldn't it be nice if investors were given an environmental impact statement of what their investment was going to do if they invested? That's not possible yet. Or takeover artists. These are changes one by one, so that finally the people who do know how to organize, who do run the world government we have, which is run by the transnationals, themselves run by the oil companies, what else? And anyhow, we do have the chance to get corporate skills at work on survival. And there can be money made in it. That is the whole. If you ever take your car, and you all do this, you take your car down to be repaired, you know that restoration is a profit-making business for the guy who sends you the bill. And this is possible, and it's a profit. It's going to cost money to restore. It's going to cost a lot of money. But it's not going to begin to cost as much money as our failure to do it. And that's my sales talk.
What are the plans to cut down the population and still have the sex?
Well, there. No, I'll see you after school.
I have one question that I think is always a hard one to ask in these talks because I'm part of the choir you're preaching to, and don't question what you're saying. At the same time, I think about the Brazilian farmer who has a family to feed. As a father, I think, boy, what's my priority? And I think about my family. I think about how strongly my desire to preserve that family is. And albeit it's a short view that if I clear more forest, I'll be able to feed my family, what that means to the global view, it's very easy for me to say, okay, but my priority is to feed my family. I can understand what you're saying to the corporate executive, and I buy into that, and I would gladly be part of that movement. But what do we say to that person?
Well, I'll say this right now. If you care about your family, you care about the opportunity of that son or daughter or grandson or grandchild to grow up in a world that has what is going to be destroyed if you don't change the present system. There won't be a chance for that child to have a family unless we make a quick shift. And part of the shift, of course, for the person in Brazil relies upon us. What are we doing? What freedom have we taken away from the people in the third world, these developing countries so-called, when we lend them money to help them out, and we require that they spend 85% of their money back with us, and then sell them things like reactors or 747s or tractors that rust in the field because they don't have maintenance, or a lot of electronic equipment, or consultants by the dozen, and then say, now, we want you to borrow some more money from us so you can pay the interest you owe us. That's what we've done. So we're forcing them to change their society to produce cash crops so they can begin to pay the interest back on the capital that has already made our own capital countries, or our own corporations, very well off because the money is spent back here with a profit margin. It's the strange circle that we haven't quite understood. So that one of the things we have to think when we say, what will we give up? You know, how many fewer bananas could you eat? How much less coffee? And so on. And you begin to think of where the cash crops come from, and how many people have to take soil that could produce food for them to produce something for us. When you think of what we've done to the fisheries off South America, where we've used them for fertilizer, so we could grow, or for cattle feed, if you will, so that we could grow more cholesterol. For what good? We've got to rethink what we've been doing to the world's resources for our own benefit. Now, I don't know what you're willing to give up. I'll be willing to give up quite a bit, but not chocolate. But that's the question. It's a big question. That, of course, is going to be a prevalent question in Brazil, in Rio, in June at this World Summit. And the answers have got to come up. We can't be just a quick fix. The answer to me, to my way of thinking, is that we've got to make basic changes in the way we think. The conventional wisdom has been very useful, but it has become a stagnant pool. We've got to go to the springs. The springs are here in dreams and ideas. And not just the dreams and the ideas, but the energy to follow through and do something about them and make them work. Now, quick inventory, then I'll be through with all this. That you're all interested in the wildness outside, and you've done a lot to preserve it and make people aware of wilderness, wildness in wilderness. But I like to ask a question. What is your heaviest organ? The skin. And just think about the skin, taking inventory. Now think about the skin. So here's this extraordinary boundary between the wildness outside and the wildness within. And it's quite interesting to take a look at the wildness within. And I just started the other day. I was listening to some long talks. I put my hands together. Just do that for a while. Just look at your own hands together. And open them up a bit and put them back. And you realize you just built, you're done with mirrors. You're all built by mirrors. Here, look at the similarity. And it's amazing. So every joint is opposite every joint. The fingernails are all about the same length. If they're long, same length long on all fingers. It's amazing when you consider how the information of those hands had to get there. This is what you're supposed to look like now. It's not perfect because all the fingerprints are different. So there's some variation, but there's a great deal of essential similarity. It was all done by mirrors. It was all done by DNA. And one thing that we keep forgetting, I'm very happy that my right hand isn't 3 feet long, my left hand this size. They both stopped at the same time. There was a signal, stop, that's enough. And we stopped growing. I hate to think of how big Paul Petzoldt would be instead of how big he is already if he hadn't stopped growing. But here, Paul had a thymus, we all had a thymus, and I said, that's enough. You might get a bit heavier after that, but you don't get any taller. You know, we get wiser, of course. But remember that, it's the ability to say stop. Where is the thymus in our economy? That's enough. All right, so that's enough looking at hands. You've been listening to a long speech. You hear it in stereo. Well, almost, because I'm just speaking one point, you can't get much stereo, but you do get stereo. And you can tell, if you close your eyes, whether I'm right or left. And that's because you have two ears. But I never thought of this until I was about 73 or so and getting wise. You can also tell if you close your eyes whether I'm above you, behind you, below you, as well as to right or left. And how do you do that? Maybe you didn't know you could, but you can. And you would know I was in front, not behind. The shape that evolved in your ear, that looks silly and all that, but that does something to sound that differentiates whether it's back or forward or above or below. Well, that was pretty clever design. You go on with the ear, and if you look, I went for a hearing aid. I refused to wear it because it just adds to the wrong noises. But I can do this well. I can do just as well this way as with my hearing. But if you look at the diagram of the ear, you realize that it couldn't possibly work. If you go to the Lawrence Hall of Science, you see this transparent business of your circulatory system. It couldn't possibly work. It does. Move from the ear to the eyes. That's pretty important. 120 million rods and cones in each retina. Again, the mirror is working. So I didn't count my own, but I suppose if there's 120 million in each, give us perception. We can see color. We can take light waves that have all this message to be meaningless to all kinds of creatures, but we take that and we read it, and it makes all kinds of meaning to us about our world. What did it take to stop at 120 million instead of going to 240 and making the whole damn thing useless? How did you develop the windshield wipers that work every 5 minutes or 5 seconds? The focusing business, as long as it lasts. Let's see, I can focus out there now. But all this whole system, then the ability to see, to take what's on your retina, and on your retina right now, I'm upside down. But your brain says, what the hell you are? Your brain switches it around. Each eye sees a different picture. Try one. And your mind is constantly resolving those two differences. And here's the depth. A very clever device. Who dreamed it up? How does it happen? And then we go out, so you had dinner. I'm looking forward to the closing the bar after this is over. But what happens at dinner? You ate all kinds of different kinds of food. You don't have to give a thought to what happens next, I hope. So the Isles of Langerhans, for most of us, are saying, well, this is what we do about the sugar in it. And so all the various chemicals are thrown in, and in due course, what you ate is divided up and shared among your trillions of cells, all equally fed except the fat cells that get a little more than they deserve. But maybe that's for purpose. No, I was about ready to stop with that, except to take a little bit more of the inventory of the wildness within us that enables us to think, to remember, to think about your own internal video. You may not know that, but everywhere you've walked, you've recorded. Now, some people get lost easier than others, but if you go back to where you've been, you will recognize landmark after landmark. I've seen this before, I know this. If you go back over your friends in your past, whether your eyes are open or closed, you can see the face, you can see the smile, you can get the expression way back. I have trouble, Paul, when I'm doing this with my fellow mountain troopers who are now 45 years older, and I'm trying to recognize what I saw 45 years ago and what I see now. And they're trying to do the same thing. But in any event, you've got this extraordinary ability to record. Where? I don't know how. And I used to stop with that. So you have that, and you have the ability to love, to have compassion, to care, and all these things. Then I had this airplane ride, where it was very dull. I couldn't see anything out the window because of clouds. So I counted the number of times I had to chew for my airline lunch. Some people amuse themselves in other ways, but I didn't. I did this, it was 2,000, and sometime later, that was a nice number. I'll try dinner, it was 4,000. I didn't want to try breakfast, I just threw in an arbitrary 1. So it's 7,000 times a day you chew. And then I began to realize, well, look what happens. Every time you chew, your tongue, the softest tissue you have, right in there between the hardest tissue you've got, your tooth enamel, has to put food on each side and get the hell out of the way before you bite. And it does it. And then, in addition to that, and then, so again, you see, some people do amuse themselves in strange ways. I went through it, how many ways, how many shapes does my tongue have to go through? What exercises to go through our alphabet? Now, you thought I was going to talk about kissing or something? No, the alphabet, and I counted 32. And it'd be worse if I were speaking French. But in any event, if you begin to think that's, I say, well, let's hear it for the tongue. And you can go on with the inventory because there's a great deal to marvel at. And I'll stop now because some of you aren't old enough to hear the rest of it. But so then I went on to the big answer. How does this happen? How does this information get transmitted? And it gets transmitted, of course. And I can say this freely because you're all enough to know there's male and female, and each contributes a little bit of biological material that has all the information necessary to make each of us. And that happens. It's happened roughly 100 billion times in the course of human history. And the essential information that made it possible for 100 billion people to grow their hands the same size, to have 120 million rods and cones, all the rest of that stuff, and to do it right, that information, as it was passed through its minimum, for all 100 billion people, would fit in a sphere 1/6 of an inch in diameter. I got that figure from Stanford University, it must be right. But that's something to marvel at. And there's more to marvel at. That how did that system develop? Science and technology? Evolution. The whole system, the progressing thing, the 3.5 billion years of life on Earth that kept developing, trying, and failing, and all this. And where did it do it? In civilization? No, it did it in wilderness. Wilderness is the utmost encyclopedia. That's where everything has been developed. That's where life has its origin. And that's why Thoreau said, in wildness is the preservation of the world. And that's why Nancy Newhall came up with this idea. The wilderness holds answers to more questions than we have yet learned how to ask. So we busily go about wiping it out. How many million acres a year do we lose? How many more million are we going to let go? Or are we going to come up with the idea that Otis Murray described way back? He said, why don't we pretend that the wilderness that is now remaining doesn't exist? Just operate without it. And I think we could do that. We'll have to do that if we go on and grind it all the way up, grind it up the way we're determined to do it seems. We can do it by the year 2000, maybe 2010 at the latest, 2010. And if we do that, then we're going to have to stop doing it because there won't be any more to do it to. We're going to have to go back and restore. So that gets to my point. Why don't we go back now? Pretend that doesn't exist for our selfish human purposes. That exists for the other living things. And if there happens to be a wilderness that nobody ever enters, that's all right. Or if there happens to be an inhabited wilderness, we need to think more about the inhabited wilderness, where it is inhabited by the people, the indigenous people, who know how to get along with it. We can handle that. The tough thing to handle is us. But we can do it. And now my final message is here. I'm going to read this because this should appeal to all of you because it comes from a mountaineer. And this comes from the book, The Scottish Himalayan Expedition, that was published 40 years ago. It's by William H. Murray. He's written a good many books, a mountaineer himself. He was on the board of directors of Friends of the Earth in the United Kingdom. I met him just once. But I read this book because I was given it to review for the Living Wilderness, when that's what they called the Wilderness Society's magazine, by Howard Seinheiser, for sailing to Bombay, so that they'd made a commitment. And just thrown away, just in the bottom of the rest of this text, is what turns out to be my religion, and maybe it's yours. Where Murray says, until one is committed, there is hesitancy, the chance to draw back, always ineffectiveness. Concerning all acts of initiative and creation, there is one elementary truth, the ignorance of which kills countless ideas and splendid plans. That the moment one definitely commits oneself, then providence moves too. All sorts of things occur to help one that would never otherwise have occurred. A whole stream of events issues from that decision, raising in one's favor all manner of unforeseen incidents and meetings and material assistance, which no man could have dreamt would have come his way. He was still doing his thing. I have learned a deep respect for one of Goethe's couplets. Whatever you can do, or dream you can, begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. Now I don't think you'll find magic in very many curricula in our universities or anywhere else. But I think if you took careful inventory, along with me, of the wildness within you, you know there's magic in you. Let it out. Thank you very much.
I'm going to grab that little button off. Good burn. I thought you were David Brower.
I'm in real trouble. I always try to get away with microphones like this.
I really thank you very much.
That's what caused all that noise, isn't it?
Yeah. Thank you very much. I certainly not going to end with anything more profound. I do want to comment that it brought back at least maybe this is my turn to come up and make a statement. And Tom Sharp, who was a trustee of the school, is the one that taught me this, was an appreciation for the Mazet. And David pointed this out in a little different fashion. And I think this is one of the values to the school. Maybe a little overlooked value. But I was a little appalled to find out when I was in Kenya a number of years ago, talking to a Maasai junior elder, and they have a terrific system there. I might add, I mean, it might be modified a little bit in some significant ways, but they have a system where, as a teenager, and they could cut out the circumcision ceremony perhaps, but as a teenager you become a Marani, or a warrior. and you go through a rite of passage. And during your rite of passage, or during your Moranihood, it's acknowledged as being okay to be a jerk and to run around and be a warrior and a protector of the nation, and you're to be fed, and it's okay to be a royal pain in the neck. And in our society, that is not acknowledged to be okay, and they have that institutionalized. And when you're done with that, your Moranihood as a teenager, with great sadness, you enter into being a junior elder. And I found out that I was a junior elder a number of years ago and just barely. I was a little on the elder side. And I thought that was a terrific system that we didn't have in the United States. Maybe Nols provides that to a certain extent. And maybe the wilderness provides something of an avenue for that. Whereas a Morani, you can go out and prove yourself. And I don't think that's to be underestimated. But as a junior elder, I was found to be deficient in that I had actually at that time was not married, which caused great consternation. And I didn't own any cattle, which both in Kenya and in Wyoming put me in the status of being rather impoverished. And but in early 30s, you were a junior elder. And then due to a number of factors that David brought up, that in terms of infant mortality and resources and so on, not too long after that, in your later 30s, you graduated from the point of being a junior elder to being a Mzee. And as a Mzee, you were a respected elder. And as a respected elder, your responsibilities were that you were to give advice. And the responsibilities of others were that you should provide, you should listen and provide beer if it's requested. And I think that's a terrific system. And I think we should all listen to our Mzees. And I think we should provide plenty of beer. So thank you very much. Incidentally, that's the end of this evening, and the beer is right over there, and the Mzees are right here, and I suggest you go at it. Thank you very much.